fan has two chain pull switches. One ends in a...
The Liberty Dome. One big sweaty...
Hey! Narcotics, stimulants, shots and... 専属マネージャーが出てきたんじゃな。
Let's go! Let's go!
I know you're...
If you have some basic knowledge of the video game industry, you will probably know how strict the Australian market is for the industry. For those who don't know, Australia has a reputation for being one of the strictest in the world when it comes to rating video games. It is an issue where many popular games seem to have trouble releasing in Australia, whereas in other countries they won't have that much to worry about with restrictions. It is something a lot of people have a lot of opinions about, mainly frustration as games are banned over something that many players themselves don't see as a major issue to begin with. I know about the restrictions in Australia, as I personally live here, but I haven't dived too deep into this as I wasn't personally affected as the games I usually play wasn't targeted. But as of recently, that changed. One of the many games I play is RimWorld, and recently was banned by the Australian Classification Board. As of making this video, the ban has been fully reversed, with RimWorld now being rated as R18+. Originally I believe it was banned because of the many atrocities you can commit in the game, which I won't go into detail with. However, after a while, the board released a statement about why it was banned, and they went on to say that the only reason the game was banned was because of drug use. To those who don't play RimWorld, RimWorld is a colony management simulator where you build a base and you try to either make your colony survive or you make their lives absolutely hell. You control what your colonies do, and you control their fates. There are many other features in this game like the role-playing elements, the modding, and many more that makes this game special. With RimWorld being banned because of drugs is confusing, as it also says they included related incentives and rewards when taking drugs. I'll admit, there is a boost NPCs will have when taking drugs, but there's also negative traits. If you're not careful, your colonies will become addicted to it, and if they don't have more after a certain amount of time, their moods become more negative, which will then lead to violent behaviors, which then can lead to, sometimes, death. To say that it seems to be giving rewards only is misleading, and with this got me curious. Not just with RimWorld, but with all the other games that were affected by the board. If RimWorld gets banned for this reason, how have other games been treated? So I decided to do some research and came across this website, which the link is in the description if you're interested. But with this website, it lists all the games that's been affected by the board. Not just games, but also movies and books. But they're not relevant to this video. This might seem random to mention, but it is related to this video. This website also made me find out there are two ways for a game to be reviewed. The first way is being manually reviewed, which is pretty self-explanatory, while the other is done automated by a system called the International Age Rating Coalition, or ARC for short. ARC is a worldwide system that was founded in 2013 where instead of people manually reviewing the game, the system questions the developers on what content is in the game and based on the answer was said, determines the age rating the game should get. This was created to help reduce the cost and time to release the game worldwide. This isn't limited to just consoles or PC games, as it also includes mobile games. Now while this sounds great, you have to keep in mind that each country has their own rules. With the specific questions answered, the age rating could be different in other countries, or worse yet, entirely banned. Now knowing how strict the Australian market is, some of you might be questioning on how many products have been banned under the ARC system. Since joining ARC in 2015, there's been a total of 1,600 products banned in Australia. Because of the number of products banned under the ARC system, and with having hardly any information, I am not even going to attempt to research that, and instead focus on the manually reviewed games, the ones that receive the refused classification or censors, etc. Additionally, I'm also not including controversial games that are listed on this website as they weren't affected by the board, but a few will be mentioned in this video if they're relevant to the topic. Anyway, enough chit chat, here's what I found out. Let's start from the beginning. The 1990s had events in its history that would change the course of the human race. Not only events would affect the human race, but also new inventions, as during this period we've seen a rise in new technologies. Hardware was becoming more complex, phones were becoming less blocky, but more importantly, it was becoming easier to play video games. Video games were becoming more and more popular during this period thanks to these machines called arcade machines, where mates go out to these arcade stores and play all kinds of video games. But now it's becoming an age where video games can be played right under your roof. With technology on the rise, we've started to see the existence of consoles becoming more popular. No longer will kids have to travel to arcade stores to play games where they can use a console at home.
Have you played Atari today?
Of course, the rise of consoles led to more popularity in games, but over the years we started to see more varieties of genres coming about. One of those genres was the rise of violent video games, and of course, parents were becoming more concerned or outraged with this new genre. Part of the main reason why parents became more concerned with this was of course not wanting their kids to be exposed to violent content. And to be fair to the parents, there weren't any warning labels on game covers when buying the product. You see, before 1993, an age rating system didn't even exist in the video game market. There were no labels or any kind of warnings to let the customer know what game they were buying, which led to parents finding out the true content the moment the game is in the console. This didn't please many parents when they found out what content is being played, and as the concern grew, eventually the camel's back broke, as two games created what is possibly one of the biggest movements in gaming history. In 1993, there was a Senate hearing that discussed the topic of violence in video games. During this hearing, there was two products that gained the most discussion. One of those products was Mortal Kombat because of its depiction of graphic violence, and the other was Night Trap with its supposed violence against women. To do a oversimplification of this event, the government said to the gaming industry, create your own rating system or we'll interfere. Leaving no choice but to act, the gaming industry started to work together to create a suitable age rating system. This led to the creation of Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB. Moving forward, video games were now rated, and now parents can be informed of what content is shown based on the label shown on the cover. A problem solved. But there is one issue, however. With the ESRB, it seems like it was only limited to North America only, not the rest of the world. They would have to create their own age rating system, which Australia was closely achieving. 1994 will be when we see a change made in Australia. The Australian government was also becoming worried about violent content in video games. Night Trap was also mentioned by the Australian government because of the violent content. Because of all of this worry, the famous Australian Classification Board was soon to be created. Well, actually it already existed. Back then it was known as the Office of Film and Literature Classification, and back then they were only reviewing movies. But now not only they have to review movies and other forms of media, but now they have to review video games. Australia now has its own rating system in video games. Before celebrating, there is one thing that should be mentioned I think is important, as this difference is what I believe is significant, and it comes down to one difference between the ESRB and the Classification Board. The ESRB is a non-government independent organisation with no government interference, while the Classification Board is government-owned. This one difference has created one of the biggest differences between both organisations. The ESRB is free to make its decisions when it comes to rating video games, while the Classification Board is filled with people who are hired by politicians. And with them having direct control means they have control of what they think you should or should not play. And we start to see the effects of this a year after the board started to review games when it banned its first ever game. Well, it wasn't just one, but two games. Dreamweb and Voyeur. Both were banned on the same day. But as suggested before, this one act created a pathway in history where Australia would become one of the strictest in the world when it comes to the video game market. Developers finding it harder to release a game that's not censored or outright banned. The first two products were the first of many to be affected by the board, with more products joining Dreamweb and Voyeur.
Right before the game's release, Bethesda decided to make the same change as the Australian version worldwide.
And let me just put it out there that what Australian censorship board is saying, that this is too edgy even for adults. So even if you're not a child, even if you're a grown adult, you should not be playing this game because it can poison your mind.
Outlast 2 has been refused classification by the Australian Classification Board, meaning the game would not be able to be sold in the country unless it toned down certain provocative content.
At this time of recording, there has been a total of 97 games being affected, with more expected to join in, knowing how the board works. Each game has its own reason behind the bans or censors, with each year having a different amount of new products joining the list. As seen on this graph, there was an interesting period in 1996 to 1997 where there was a significant increase of games affected. The total amount of products is 30 games, which is vastly different compared to the other years. So why did this happen in the first place? From what it looks like, 24 out of the 30 products had involvement from the Victorian and New South Wales police force. It went as far as to the police raiding stores to keep it out of the public eye. With the reasons that were given for the ban, most of them are unknown. Not all, but most. 2 did have reasons behind it, which both were banned because of the nudity that was shown, and there were 2 other products where it was likely that nudity was for the reason for the ban. One detail I should have mentioned before is that the stores that were raided aren't normal stores you usually think about, but rather adult-related stores. With the given information, plus the name of some of these products, I'll say that most were likely banned for intimate material, you can say. Now we know the circumstances behind the bans in 1996 to 1997. The games that were involved in this incident will be removed from the graph. With them removed, that leaves a total of 73 products from 1995 up to present day. 73 games since 1995 is still quite a bit. But keep in mind that 73 products doesn't mean all had been banned. This is a list here with the number of products that were affected. But it should be noted that the products that received the refused classification rating are still high. The number of products that are still banned to this day is 31 games, leaving the rest to be allowed into the market, which is 42 products. Future me here, I want to make a small correction. You see this game right here, Postal 2? You might have noticed that this game is in the banned section. Well, I found out that Postal 2, which was banned in the past, is no longer banned, which will mean that Postal 2 will be in the unbanned section with the correct numbers being 30 games banned and 43 not banned. It would also mean that this game would be in the overturned section, which the video will go right into after this announcement. I might as well mention this other thing, as I didn't mention this in the video. Let's choose Postal as an example. With Postal, this has been banned in the past and there has been no reclassification of this game. But there has been a remastered version called Postal Redux, and that did pass the Australian censors. But Postal is still in the banned section though. The reason that Postal is still in the banned section is because I'm including that specific game only, and not the remasters or other versions of the game that might have passed. This includes others that have been remastered with the original game still banned. But yeah, just a small correction with that. For those 42 games, it's great they managed to get into the Australian market, but it's not all good news for most of the games. Out of the 42 games, 25 are still censored. It used to be higher with 29 games. What makes these censored overturned games different from the normal overturns is that the normal overturned games were banned, but with the developers sending the appeals, managed to reverse the bans. The ones that joined the censored section were released in Australia, but were censored for a brief period before being fully uncensored. The main reason why they managed to change the rating is all thanks to the R18+, which was introduced in 2013. You see, before 2013, the highest rating the video game market could get was MA15+, which means it will be harder to release a game because of the strict standards. But with the R18+ being introduced, we've seen not only it become easier for the market, but also some games becoming uncensored. Even with that though, only 4 games became uncensored, so not a big difference. If you were curious on why they were censored in the first place, here's the reasons they were given. On the plus side of things, as seen before, 12 out of the 42 games have been overturned. Such examples of games to be overturned are Disco Elysium, Alien vs Predator, and more recently RimWorld. On the rest of the graph, 3 products here had their age rating changed with 1 other and 1 unknown. Now with the age rating, what this means is that for some reason the rating of these games was changed after the game was released in Australia. One of the games affected was Dragon Ball Origins, which was originally rated PG, but there was a recall of this product as it was reported to be rated incorrectly and was reclassified as M for sexual references. One other game was Gothic 2, and this one is hard to find information other than the refused classification website, but based on the given information, it was rated as M in 2003, and for some reason its rating was revoked in 2009 with no reason behind it. To find more information that could help us, we have to go into this website called Australian Classification. This website is what the board uses for general updates, like if a product was banned or a re-review of a certain product was announced. This website also shows you the board's rating history, showing the rating of the game and the date when this decision was made. It will also show the product's history, which can inform us if it got refused classification and if that was overturned. If you go onto this website and search Gothic 2 on the search bar, you'll find the original age rating it first received in 2003, but no mention of supposed revoked classification. It's not like they don't show pages of revoked games, as other products that had their rating revoked were mentioned on this website. But it's possible that this page was deleted, as I've come across evidence of old pages of games being revoked and for some reason is no longer on the website. One thing that's interesting about Gothic 2 is that there's no mention of a reclassification, which means it could still be revoked. Or maybe the decision was reversed as there's no evidence of a rating being revoked. But I don't know with the limited information. But at this moment, Gothic 2 is unknown at this rate. With the last game in the age rating section, it will be mentioned later on in the video as it dives into a certain topic that's discussed later. Now for the other. The product that's in this is none other than GTA San Andreas. I think a lot of you will know this story. A lot of you will know that this is known as the hot coffee controversy. But to those who don't know about this controversy, this cut content was a mode where the player could find himself participating. Sounds innocent enough, but it's not any kind of participation you're thinking about. To activate this mode, you'll need to find a girl, or your girlfriend for that matter. After you arrange in meeting up with her and finishing your date together, you go back to her place to drop her off, and then she invites you in for a coffee, which you can say yes or no. If you say yes, you'll find out that she's asking for a different kind of hot coffee. With what was just said, you wouldn't need to know what happens next. In the base game, you only hear sounds suggesting what they're doing in the house. But with this mode, instead of showing a cutscene outside of the house, this mode makes you participate in the act with your girlfriend. That's what this mode is, and as mentioned before, Rockstar was originally going to add this into the game, but at some point during development, Rockstar decided to cut it. But not fully. They didn't delete any files of this mode, but rather make it inaccessible. They believe that no one will ever find this mode in the files, and never see the light of day in the public eye. Well, they were wrong to think that. After the game was released, a curious modder was going through the game files and found something interesting. What he stumbled upon was the hot coffee mode, and that was when the mode became known to the public eye. When reports came out about this hidden feature, there was massive controversy against Rockstar. And of course, the classification board reacted. Upon hearing reports of this hidden feature and investigating themselves, they revoked the MA15+ rating GTA San Andreas had. This means that since it was revoked, it had to be taken off the shelves. Because of the controversy itself, Rockstar deleted all traces of this hot coffee mode in their files. Now, this isn't because of Australia revoking the game, but GTA San Andreas had all kinds of trouble back in the mainland of the USA. And this is the most logical decision they could do. After the mode was fully taken out, Rockstar resubmitted the game, which was re-rewarded as its original age rating before being revoked. So as you know, based on this incident, content was taken out, but that content wasn't meant to be seen in the public eye. And nothing else was taken out, which is why it's put in as other. Technically, while nothing was taken out in the base game, it was still affected by the board. Now for the last game on the graph, the reason this is put in as unknown is because to me, it is unknown if the game is censored or not, or became overturned. This game is paranautical activity. What makes this interesting is the rating history it has. The first rating was manually reviewed, which was done on the 5th of January 2016, and got a refused classification. But 11 days later, under the ARC rating system, it received an M rating. And 2 years later, it was reviewed under ARC again, and this time it got an MA15+. Since the two more recent reviews were done under ARC, there's not a lot of information of the differences between the two. Plus, with the lack of information, it is unknown if it was censored or wasn't. Plus, with me not owning the game, I can't really find out. If you are curious about why it was banned in the first place, it's because of the use of drugs. I will go more in depth with all of the reasons every product had later on. Now that the main graph is completed, you would think there isn't much else to say, which you are sadly mistaken, as there's more to talk about, particularly in the censored games. As previously mentioned, 25 games are censored still, but there is one detail I didn't mention. You see, 5 out of the 25 have been pre-censored. To understand what pre-censored means, it means that Australia has that much of a reputation with its strict reviews that a few developers decided to just censor the game and not show the full game before even showing what this product is to the board. This used to be higher with 7 products being pre-censored, but due to certain circumstances, or the developer overreacting at first, they were uncensored at a later date. With part of the pre-censored, or any other censored product, they would remove some sort of gameplay element they think is too offensive to the board. But that is not always the case. One game that had the least change was Scarface: The World Is Yours. What was taken out was nothing in the gameplay section but more of the movie counterpart Scarface, as they decided to remove clips or advertisements of the movie. The reason was that because the movie was rated R18+, and the highest rating video games could get at the time was MA15+, so Scarface: The World Is Yours is technically the least affected. Other pre-censored games had some odd choices made against them, like them sending the game to be reviewed, and then giving the A-OK by the board, but then still censors the game. The 2 products that decided to take this approach were COD World War II and Crysis 3 Remastered. COD World War II first originally got an R18+, with warning labels of high impact violence, online interactivity, and sexual threat. Even with that though, the board still thought it was okay to be allowed into Australia, but for some reason, Activision decided to censor the product, with no mention of ST anywhere. What makes it amusing is that even with the ST content taken out of the rating, it is still R18+. Crysis 3 Remastered is pretty much the same story. First received a rating that still allowed a release into Australia, but decided to censor the game still. But unlike COD World War II, this one is a little more strange. To put in more context what I mean, when the original Crysis 3 was released, it was rated as MA15+, with violence being the main reason for the high rating. But with Crysis 3 Remastered, even though there's no mention of it before, it was now given an R18+, mainly because of interactive drug use. It's kinda odd that the original Crysis 3 didn't mention this interactive drug use, while Crysis 3 Remastered does, but there could be a chance that the board wasn't aware of the interactive drug use in the original game. The only thing I could find that could be related to this is this mushroom you can find in one of the levels that has a smiley face, and after you eat it you start to trip balls. But even though it wasn't banned, Crytek wasn't happy with this rating and seemed to have cut this interactive drug use from the game, as the next review mentioned no drugs, with the rating now being MA15+. Those who do not live in Australia and play video games will think, well, thank fuck I don't live here, and would like to imagine that these changes made on COD and Crysis weren't affected where you live. In most circumstances, you would be lucky, but unfortunately, these 2 products were censored not just in Australia, but worldwide, all thanks to the classification board. Thanks to them, out of the 25 games that were censored, 7 of them were censored worldwide because of the board. On the plus side though, the rest of the products, 16 to be exact, were not affected by Australia, with the last 2 being unknowns. I should point out however that even though Australia had no direct influence with 16 products, it still doesn't mean that they aren't censored or banned in other countries. With the worldwide censorship, here are the games that were affected. Regarding the 2 unknowns, these 2 were censored, but it's kinda unknown if the censorship was Australia only or worldwide. But I should mention that based on the evidence between the 2, it's more likely that they were a worldwide effect because of Australia. The 2 lucky games are Shellshock NAM 67 and Outlast 2. Starting with Outlast 2, it was banned by the classification board, but then was rated again sometime later. It was then reported by Red Barrels, the makers of the Outlast series, that the first submission was a mistake, as it had content from the other version of the game that didn't represent the final version. With the affected scene in mind, from what it looks like in the final version of the game, there were a few changes made in this particular scene that got it banned in the first place, with a few noticeable differences or removes. With this though, I don't know if the developer is using this as an excuse, saying that it was old content that wasn't meant to be seen by the board, when in reality it was meant to be in the game. And other sources do say that this was a worldwide censor because of Australia, and for all I know it most probably is. But with the developer not directly confirming whether Australia was the sole reason for the worldwide censorship or not, it makes me wary of putting it on the worldwide censor. With Shellshock NAM, the story of this is odd, you can say. Before continuing, I need to mention that this story that's going to be talked about is only mentioned on the refused classification website. Take this story with a grain of salt. With the story of Shell Shock, a bloke named Simon notes that Shell Shock's first review got a refused classification, and then later with the second review received an MA15+. Simon became a little suspicious and contacted Atari. Atari wasn't the developer of Shell Shock, but they were the applicant when showing this game to the board. When Simon called Atari, he asked if the game was censored in Australia. Atari said that it wasn't banned in the first place, but rather delayed, which is a complete lie. As on the Australian classification website, you see that Shell Shock NAM was banned when it was first reviewed. Simon then contacted the classification board and asked the same question. Unlike Atari, they provided some useful information, where they say that the first version of the game, which is noted as rough and unfinished, was banned. The game was resubmitted again, and this time, supposed controversial gameplay was seen in context and that received an MA15+. With the game being censored, all Atari said was that Australia was going to have the same version that every other country is getting, and said that nothing was changed from the previous versions. But with them saying that though, it was still censored. Some drug visuals were taken out, but its removal had nothing to do with the board saying it's unsuitable. There was one other feature that was censored, and it was the souveniring of the enemy's ears. And this was for the behest of the board. This one quote suggests that Australia did have a worldwide effect, as Atari previously said that Australia would be getting the same version as everyone else. It doesn't help that Atari was lying about being banned, and saying that it's the same as previous versions. With Atari lying, I'll say this is an open and shut case of this game being lightly censored worldwide thanks to Australia, but that is for you to decide on that matter. By going over everything, we get to see a wider variety of products that not only affects Australians, but also other people in other parts of the world thanks to the classification board. With the products being banned and censored, it is also equally as important to see the reasons for the given bans and censors, as it's important to understand what content is allowed into Australia and what ones will have the hardest time. To understand how data was collected, I have to show you what was done to make it easier to understand what is going on. As you know, games have their reasons for the ban or censor, etc. To make it easier on what content affected the game, I created these slots. Of course, violent games go into violence and vice versa with every other slot. However, there is some cases of games using more than 2 reasons. When a game does have 2 reasons, I created another slot just for that circumstance. I should note that this only includes reasons that don't have any correlation with one another. Ones that did have 2 reasons but still falls under the specific reason will still stay in the same slot as there is no different correlations from one another. Starting with games that received refused classification, and still to this day, here's what's been collected. At a simple glance, we can see that games with any kind of sexually related reason seem to be more likely in getting banned. With the number of products, it has more than violence, drug use, and other/unknown combined, with a total of 17 games, which one of them is in the mixed slot. While it outweighs every other slot with the numbers, every product in this has its different reasons why it was banned in the first place. If we were to separate every one of them for their own reasons, this is what we would see. Both violence and sexual activity would be equally the same, with both having 5 products. With the rest of the list, we see drug use with 4 games, with one of them being in the mixed slot, with other/unknown having 4 products. Moving on to non-banned games, this will be a little different. As you know, there are different types of unbanned games, overturned, censored, age rating, etc. Instead of putting it all in as one, I'll be putting them in their own sections. I will still follow the same graph as before, but with different types of unbanned games. So basically just overturned games and overturned, censored games and censored, vice versa. Starting with overturned games, we can see that violent content has 6 products overturned, which would be 8 if counting 2 products in the mixed slot. It kinda isn't surprising seeing how low drug use and sexually related games have been overturned. Actually, from what it looks like, the first drug game to be overturned was We Happy Few, which was released in 2016, with Disco Elysium being in 2021 and RimWorld in 2022. Sexually related games are even unluckier, as from what it looks like, the last game to be overturned was in 2003. Moving on to censored games, we can see that all 3 are equally targeted. Taking the lead is violence, which has 7 games. Sexual and drug related products are close behind with 6 and 5 games affected. Drug games seem to be more likely in getting censored rather than overturned or banned, which is kind of surprising, as previously I thought more games with this kind of content were banned, but it seems like they're more likely in getting censored instead. The same would be said with sexual games, with them more likely to get censored rather than overturned. But as you know, unlike games with drug themes, sexual related games have more of a chance of getting banned instead. We went through most of pre-censored age rating and other /unknown games already, but might as well show them still. Again, games with sexual content seem to be the ones that are getting hit the most. But to me, that doesn't come across as surprising when taking note of the government's stance against this content. If we were to take every section of unbanned games and combine them as one, the final results we would see are 12 violent games, 10 drug use, and 14 sexually related, with 4 having mixed reasons, with the last 2 products being other/unknown. With them combined, I think it's time we go to the grand finale. In the final graph, everything will be combined from banned to non-banned games. With everything combined, in the 73 games that has been affected, 18 of them are violent content, 13 drug use, and 31 being sexually related, with of course the additional 6 in other/unknown, and the final 5 in the mixed slot. The affected reasons for the 5 games will be shown here on what categories these would have fallen under. With the number of violent games that has been affected, and with it taking the leaderboard if sexual games weren't combined as one, you'd probably be thinking that violent content continues to be an issue to this day, but I'm happy to report that that is not the case. Most of these bans and censors took place in the early 2000s up to the 2010s. The last game that used violence for the reason for the ban was back in 2011, and this product was Mortal Kombat. This change in attitude towards violent video games I believe stems from the R18+ introduction in 2013, which as of right now, 9 games were affected because of violence since 2011. I would also like to think that maybe the board's attitude towards violent video games has become less extreme and maybe become a little more mature. Again, as I said, just a little. Because even though the board is not as vicious towards violent content, the opposite is said with others. Since 2011, 20 games were affected. Half of them were drug related. Before 2011 back to 1995 was only 4. Back to the 20 games, 10 were sexually related, with the last one having a mixture of reasons behind it. One final thing before moving on. What we're going to be looking at now is the different age rating comparisons between the ESRB and the classification board. Most ratings between both organizations have very similar ratings to one another when it comes to non-banned games. It's a little different when a product was banned in Australia, however, but still, it's interesting seeing the age rating differences in America and seeing how they react to these certain games. But there are some cases where both banned and non-banned games where there were surprising outcomes. Starting with the first example, South Park: The Stick of Truth was rated as R18 after being censored in Australia, while in America, the ESRB gave it an M17+. Not much of a difference, but why I find this amusing is that South Park: The Stick of Truth was censored in Australia, getting rid of some of the more controversial parts of the game, while over in America, none of the content was taken out, and yet it was still given an M17+ when they do have their own adult rating. Well, it's probably for the best it's not rated under that, as while there's nothing bad with the rating itself, it's more that distributors refuse to sell games with the adult rating. It has so much of a reputation that it's been given the term the kiss of death. Continuing, the oddest rating comparison in my personal opinion is Paranactal Activity. As you know, it was banned in Australia but now is MA15+. In America though, they've given this game a bloody teen rating. Now, you will say, what is really the differences between MA15+ and teen, as they're around the same age category? With the differences between the two, it comes down to the content that these ratings are meant to represent. With teens, the content that these games fall under in this rating is that content may contain violence, suggestive themes, crude humor, minimal blood, simulated gambling, and or infrequent use of strong language. The basic stuff, you can say. With people buying teen games, I'm not sure what the legal requirements are, but I think that as long as you're not a literal young child, I think teenagers of all ages will be fine getting teen-rated games with no ramifications. Now for MA15+, for the people that lives outside Australia, MA15+ means that it's legally restricted. The meaning of this term is that if you are under the age of 15, you cannot legally own, buy, or rent content with this rating. But if you're with a parent or guardian that allows you to have this product, then you will have no problems. When I was younger, I was kinda confused with this age rating, because we have another rating which is M, which literally is the same age as MA15+, but the differences between the two mainly depends on the content that's shown on the product. The M rating means it's moderate maturity, so no strong themes. Plus, while it recommends people under the age of 15 not see the product with this rating, there is no restrictions if you were underage. With MA15+, while it's the same age category as M, represents the hardcore strong themes this rating falls under, the baddest of the bad. This can stem from violence, sex scenes, or drug use. I'm willing to bet that the supposed drug use that the game had gave it an MA15+. But in America, if that content is still in the game, they still gave it a teen rating, which goes to show the differences between the ESRB and the board. Another surprise was 2 products that were banned in Australia. In most cases over in America, when a game was banned in Australia, most of these games in America would be given an M17+, but that's not always the case however, as there's examples of games where they were banned in Australia and yet received a teen rating in America. 1 or 2 examples of this are these 2 anime games, Death Smiles 1 and 2, and Labyrinth of Death. Not only both are anime games, but they were banned for the same reason as well, which is the depiction of the child in the game, which warrants the board to ban it. Over in America, the supposed depiction of a child didn't seem to make the ESRB question it, because they gave both games a teen rating. This comes across as a surprise because, as I mentioned before, most games that were banned in Australia would usually get an M17+ in America, but there are cases of these where the age rating is teen. And this comes into question whether the board is justified with these bans, or they're overreacting as always. These are not the only ones with slight or big differences from one another. While I didn't talk about many examples, I think it's important to show the differences between the ESRB and the classification board and where their priorities are at. I hope that the collected data that was shown gives a bit of a wider idea on how the board runs. It's interesting going through the collected information as a lot of these products you could say were treated unfairly, but I'm willing to bet that some people who are watching this will be saying that all of these reasons that the board has given are justifiable. To a certain extent, yes, some of these games really do push the necessary boundaries that make it questionable with what the developers were thinking when making the product. But with these games affected being justifiable, then you would have to agree that games with similar content that the board seems to have trouble with should be treated equally, as to literally everyone. It's something that's fair to do. But dear viewer, would you be surprised that the classification board, with its history, would disagree? With all of the games that were shown to be affected, every one of them had its own different kinds of content that the board seemed to have issues with their own different kinds of themes and features in the game that made the board reacting negatively to. This would bring a question to some people on whether there has been 2 games with the same content, and if there were, what were the different outcomes? Most products are too different from one another where a comparison between each other is not possible, but there are a few games where content is similar. Not similar to the point where it's a rip-off to the first game that introduced this feature, but rather has a unique way of its gameplay mechanic, but still similar. You would think that 2 games with similar content would be treated the same by the board, but you'll be mistaken to think that, as games that were compared to one another had very different outcomes. Luckily, the Refused classification website has shown a few comparisons of these games, which makes my job easier. On the Refused classification website, there are a few pages where there's a section where it talks about the comparisons between 2 video games. The very first example of 2 games being compared is Dark Sector and Fallout 3. We all know what Fallout 3 is, but for the basic rundown for those who haven't heard of this game, Fallout 3 is an action role-playing game where it takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where you were born in a vault and stayed for most of your life. But due to certain events, were forced to leave the place you used to call home, and now has to explore the apocalyptic wasteland. But as you explore the wasteland, you come across new areas and characters that advances the story. But you also have to watch out for enemies as well, as the wasteland is never safe. Now for Dark Sector, from what I can gather, the game takes place in a country called Lyzria, a satellite country bordering the Soviet Union. During this time, a new virus appeared called the Technocyte, which, once infected, will become mutated into these creatures. You play as a CIA agent, and your job is to save the world by preventing the spread of this virus. Both Fallout 3 and Dark Sector was censored by the board for different reasons. Dark Sector was censored due to the violent content, while Fallout 3 was censored due to drugs. Dark Sector was forced to remove some of this violent content, like a few takedown animations and a specific gameplay mechanic that will be mentioned shortly. With Fallout, nothing was taken out of the game, rather they just changed the name of the drug. This drug was originally named morphine, but because of the board, Bethesda changed the name from Morphing to Med-X. Different reasons, as you can see. Plus, with the basic storyline of these games, you wouldn't see any comparisons to one another. But it's not what's in its story that makes it similar, but more of the gameplay mechanic in both games. One mechanic that's in both games is the dismemberment system. In order to be able to chop off enemies' limbs in Dark Sector, you can only use this blade. With Fallout 3, it's not as limited as you can use any firearms and melee weapons that can make enemies' limbs explode. They both also have a slowdown feature, with Dark Sector using the blade while Fallout 3 uses the VAT system. So a few similarities in the gameplay. As you know, Dark Sector was forced to remove this specific gameplay mechanic that was mentioned before. This system happens to be the dismemberment system. And as you know, Fallout 3 has the same mechanic, and yet that feature wasn't censored. You could say maybe they were released years apart from each other when the board was more strict with violent content, which could be possible with other games, but not this one because they were only released 7 months apart from each other, and I don't think the board would have changed that much in 7 months. I'll admit, I do think Dark Sector is more violent when compared to Fallout 3, especially some of the takedown animations, which some were removed for the Australian release. But even with that though, it's very questionable why the dismemberment system seems to be an issue to the board with one game, but with a different game like Fallout 3, they turn a blind eye and are more concerned about the name of a drug. Continuing, this one inconsistency, in my personal opinion, is the oddest one, as this game was censored for one reason, when in reality it was a completely different reason. This product was none other than Dreamweb, one of the first games to be banned. I'm not going to go into the plot details as it's irrelevant to why it was banned. What made this game get banned in the first place was one scene. Before explaining the scene, I'll mention the reason it got for the ban. The reason was sexualized V. Now for that reason alone, that sounds bad, but before judging, we need to look at the scene itself. In this game, you're going around to different rooms killing enemies. In one room that you enter, there's this couple that's having an intimate moment together. During this, the girl who's on top of the guy notices you and jumps off to hide under the bed. As she jumps off the guy, you get to see the man's privates before he covers them up with a pillow. During all of this, you pull out your gun and then you shoot the guy in the head. When I first saw this, I'll admit, I was confused. But that was when I thought this game was banned for sexual V, not sexualized V. Now, knowing the different terms that are used, I guess maybe you can see this kind of violence occurring, but using this term is pushing it a bit, as this word can be used for sexual V as well. So while the word meaning is very loose with the context of the scene, if you look carefully, I guess maybe you can see this reason used for the scene. But that was before finding out that this game was censored. With what was censored, it was reported that the only difference that was made to the game was that clothes were added to the couple. No mention of toning down violence or anything else. This discovery puts in a different viewpoint with this. With the initial term they originally used for the ban, sexualized V, it just seems like the issue they seemed to have wasn't really the violence that was shown, but rather the nudity. Sexualized V was the main reason for this ban, and yet that hasn't changed, just them having a little more clothes on during the intimate moment. As I mentioned before, it just seems like this game was banned for nudity and not sexualized V, and if that was the case, then why not communicate that it was nudity that caused this ban? The only thing I can think of is that since clothes were added, the board probably didn't see it as a sexual act anymore. I mean, just because clothes are on doesn't mean it can't be a sexual act anymore. You can still do other things. Another example of the board's inconsistencies or hypocrisies is the game that started all of this research in the first place, RimWorld. As stated in the introduction of this video, RimWorld was banned for drug use. Looking over the Steam where the board left when it was first banned, it lists off a few pieces of information. One thing that needs to be mentioned is that based on the classification of Computer Games 2012, games with supposed drugs can't be in any other rating other than R18+, and that any interactive illicit or prescribed drug use can't be detailed and realistic, and that games with drugs can't make drugs be incentive or awarding, which I guess is because they don't want games with drug themes somehow encouraging the audience to take that stuff, even though the said audience is over 18 years old. The board's comments on detailed and realistic, incentive and awarding are very interesting, because they say that this kind of content is not allowed in the first place, and yet they can't even follow that rule. A really good example of this is none other than GTA 5. You see, in both single player and multiplayer, you can make your character smoke a goddamn bong. I don't know about you, but this interactive drug use seemed to be pretty accurate and realistic to me. Not only that, but it also has drugs that even awards you. In GTA Online, you can take this drug called Bullshock Testosterone, where once taken, the drug increases the toughness of the character. and even somehow makes bullets do more damage than if you weren't tripping balls. And even better, there is no negative side effects, but for some reason, the board is all fine for that. So you telling me that RimWorld, where drugs give you negative side effects, not detailed and realistic, and that gets banned, while GTA 5 allows you to use a bong that's realistic, and also has drugs that make it rewarding for you when taking it, and yet it doesn't get a ban? This is one of many with the board's inconsistencies and hypocrisies. There are other examples like Soldier of Fortune Payback getting censored for its depiction of violence. Guess one of the mechanics that was removed? The dismemberment system. And this is nearly a year before the release of Fallout 3, or more bizarrely on what happened to Bug Butcher. This game was censored worldwide because there was a power-up that was named Speed Injection, and for some reason it wasn't okay because, as the board says, speed is a common street name for stimulated drugs, particularly those from the amphetamine drug families. And because of the word speed makes it associated with real-world drugs, warranted a ban, which left the developers no choice but to change the name of the power-up to Boot Juice. I'm sure there are many other examples that I've missed, but with everything that was just talked about, with certain content not okay for one game but is allowed on a different game, using the wrong reason for the ban, or not even following their own rules, how can we be sure that the board follows up on these rules if they can't even do it in the first place? While the board has made some questionable decisions,
I guess we look pretty silly at the moment.
Some of the decisions were based on being pressured by a few government representatives to get a certain game banned. Now, only very few developers were lucky enough to have government officials calling for the ban on their games. But the two best examples of government interference were the incidents around Manhunt and getting up contents under pressure. Let's start with Manhunt. With Manhunt, it was released as MA15 Plus for a brief period. Now, with the story of this game, you're a prisoner on death row that is forced to participate in some sort of snuff film where you have to murder criminal gang members. That's the real basics of it. With the game, it had a few controversies surrounding it, like the extreme violent gameplay. The other more unfortunate incident, however, was that it was blamed for the death of a 14-year-old as the murderer, or his friend, murdered him in cold blood as he failed to rob Stefan as the murderer owed money to gang members, which was around £75 that he owed. After the incident, reports came out that the game was found in the murderer's possessions. Stefan's parents also came out to blame the game as they believed Stefan's friend was obsessed with the game. But after investigating, the police rejected any links to the killing, while also debunking the rumor of the game being found in the killer's bedroom, when in reality, it was found in Stefan's bedroom. Controversies like this had negative impacts worldwide for Manhunt. And no different here, as 2 weeks after the murder incident, the Western Australian Opposition Party called for the ban, and the opposition's leader created a bit of noise about this, went on to say that states should have censorship powers, along with creating noise in state parliament. Based on this controversy in Western Australia, the at the time Attorney General called for the game to be reviewed. Then in September, nearly a year after its initial release, was confirmed to be banned for extreme violence. Based on what's been said about the product with the controversy surrounding it, it's not surprising when a game like this was banned, especially after the terrible murder incident, even though it didn't have any links to it. But when events like this comes out, it's pretty much a ripple effect, especially here in Australia. While I don't agree with anything that the opposition's leader said about the game, nor his views on states having censorship powers, it's not surprising when a game like this was banned, as mentioned before. But what is surprising is what happened with getting up contents under pressure. What I show you is nothing compared to what this game had to deal with by government officials. As like Manhunt, let's start with the story of Getting Up. The main premise of the story is that you play as a character named Train, who is a graffiti artist set in a fictional city. In this story, the government is corrupt, to the point where freedom of expression is suppressed. At first, Train was only doing graffiti just to gain popularity, but as his character develops and the plot thickens, he then uses his graffiti skills as a tool to fight against suppression. But it's not simple as that, as along the way you'll be forced to fight some ordinary street thugs, while also dealing with the mayor's wrath. That's the overall story. From the sounds of it, it sounds like an interesting story. But as you know, there's a few people in the government that did not like the idea of this game. So who voiced their objection? Well, this game caused a response from the Queensland councils, the at the time mayor of Townsville, and even the premier of Queensland called for the ban. And this is even before the game was released in Australia. Why don't they want this game released? Well, it's the graffiti, of course, and influencing young people to break the law. Now, they aren't the only ones that voiced their objection when it comes to the release of Getting Up. However, with more officials calling out this game, we can see the kind of responses they made regarding this game being released. Most have come to the same conclusion of how this game would encourage graffiti, saying that this would lead to a rise of graffiti in cities, while along the way saying that it costs millions of dollars to remove them each year. Some others would say that graffiti wasn't the only issue, and went as far as to say that a game like this that involves violence and gang warfare would have the impact on the community's safety. That's odd, because San Andreas was released 2 years before Getting Up, and that had fallen gang warfare and violence, and there was no calls from the government to ban this. I mean, it was banned at one point, but that was because of the hot coffee incident, but was re-released when the code for hot coffee was removed. But the best take from this was by the Gold Coast mayor, who went as far as to say that they never seen an evil attempt to influence youngsters to break the law than this product. These are only a few statements they said about this game. If you want to read all of the statements that was made, I suggest you read it from the website. Now, while the Queensland government expressed their concerns about the game, unfortunately for them, the game was rewarded an MA15+ rating. I should mention that being rated doesn't mean it's being released yet, it's just the rating confirmed for its release. Even though the game was now rated, there was still no out of trouble. After the announcement, the Queensland councils made urgent calls to ban the product, and the Western Australian Local Government Association also joined in the bandwagon, while adding in that it cost them $25 million each year to remove graffiti and repair property. I checked for myself to see if it's true, and yeah, it costs Western Australia $25 million per year. For those who were curious as I was, it costs Australia as a whole between $1.5 to $2 billion to remove graffiti. So you learn something new every day. Not long after the Western Australian Local Government Association joined the bandwagon, the same Attorney General from before called for the game to be re-reviewed. Now, if you thought that the government's responses were mind-blowing, it doesn't even come close to the board's reasoning for the ban. After deciding to ban this game, the reason they gave for its ban is that this game promoted crime. This is the first and last time that this reason was used as a justification for a ban. I'm sorry, but if promoting crime was a serious category that games had to follow, then nearly every game in existence would be banned. What makes even less sense is that graffiti games were released in Australia before and faced no issues, like Jet Set Radio and its sequel Jet Set Radio Future, which were released in 2000 and 2002. If the government had that much of an issue with graffiti, then why would these two games, along with others, get a free pass when Getting Up doesn't? To make it even better, a game as recent as 2016, King Spray Graffiti VR, received a G rating. However, I'll admit that this was reviewed under the ARC system, and that this was created just as an art game, whereas in Getting Up, it was used more in illegal activities. But the point still stands where how come Getting Up gets ridiculed for its content, mainly the graffiti in the game, while other products who have the exact same premise, aka the graffiti, don't get banned, while Getting Up does, and is the only game to ever receive the refused classification because of promoting crime. Given the previous information, we now know that the government does have a bit of influence with some video game outcomes. You might remember another product was shown to have also been influenced. I didn't show this at first, as Getting Up and Manhunt had the most intense standoff against the government. But this game, I also want to lead up to the next topic, which is that the government, or the media in this circumstance, doesn't get what they always want. This game is Dead or Alive Dimensions. Now, this game caused a little bit of controversy, not by the Australian government, which certainly is a surprise. The source of controversy came from Sweden. In Sweden, they banned this game for allegedly having child pornography. This kind of development happening in Sweden caught the Australian media's attention, which then the media also caught the attention of Brendan O'Connor, who was a Home Affairs Minister during this time. He raised his concerns about this and demanded to know why was this game released. That was when the classification board decided to revoke the PG rating, so basically ban until Nintendo resubmitted the game. They also stated that they weren't aware of the specific content that was in the game. Later, Nintendo resubmitted the game and it was unbanned, but the PG rating that was given before was no longer used and was now an M-rated game. Now some of you will be very confused about the decision that was made because, as you know, they rated a PG to only revoke it when the media and Brandon raised concerns about it. It's not like GTA San Andreas where there was actual hidden content in the code. Dead or Alive had no hidden content. All of it was there from the get-go. If there was this kind of content in the game, then how did the classification board fuck up that badly? Well, it stems from how they review games. From what the board does, they don't play the games themselves. Maybe. There are 4 different types of applications you can choose from, with each of them having a different price fee with their own guidelines that you have to follow. For example, they will have a detailed description of the game, footage of it, content, etc, etc. Once you have the chosen application you wish to follow, there are a few extra demands that you have to follow no matter what application you choose. Those are sending the actual copy of the game, a completed application of a classification of a computer game form, and the correct fee of the chosen application. There's other interesting information, but this video is already too long than it already is. But basically, the ones that make the decisions are, well, of course the board. But if the developers were unhappy with the decision and sent an appeal, this includes films mind you, it isn't sent to the first officials who made the first decision, but instead goes to the review board who decides on the appeals. So basically, the classification board and the review board are independent from one another. The review board were the ones that unbanned RimWorld and Disco Elysium. Just a side note, if you disagree with the decision the board made with the rating they decided and you wanted another review, you're gonna have to pay $10,000. So unless you are confident that your game or movie doesn't fit in line with the age rating you first received, then you will have a 50-50 chance of changing the rating at the price of $10K. Whether the board plays the games is unknown, as from the looks of things they mainly focus on the documentation or video footage the developers sent. The board was criticized in the past for failing to play games when reviewing them. Whether they still do this, I'm not sure. But anyway, getting back on topic, with 3 products, while 3 is one too many, it's better than 4 or 5. But there could have been at some point where more games would have had interference, as these weren't the only ones that were targeted. Just how many, you ask? Well, this much. Each product here has its own mini story behind it with the government or media's reaction to it. Some only gained very minor attractions or just one-off comments, but a few others were more persistent against the certain product. For one example, our good old mate Peter tried to ban a game named Fable, but, from the looks of it, he failed to task to do so. Another one of our old friends, Brandon, sent an appeal to the board. This game that was being reviewed was named We Dare. We Dare got some controversy thanks to the media, which because of the controversy he sent an appeal. This time, unlike Dead or Alive Dimensions, it wasn't revoked and it still kept its original age rating. Now there is a case where there are 2 games that might have had some interference. The 2 products are Narc and Rule of Rose. Narc caught the interest of one state representative, and in response if Narc was possibly releasing in Australia, the MP pretty much said that video games that involved all of these concepts would trigger psychotic behaviour, which, shortly after, the game got refused classification. Now with Rule of Rose, with some background of the game, it had some trouble in Europe, where politicians criticised the content, which caught the media's attention in Australia. Shortly after, the developer announced they will not be releasing their game in Australia. With what was just said, you might have come up with your own conclusions if there was interference here based on the simplistic information, but it is important to know the context of both games. With the case of Narc, it's leaning more likely of not having any kind of interference. Yes, a representative raised concerns about this, and some other people in the public eye as well. But regarding the representative, one point that leans to them not having direct influence is the position of power they had. Just a reminder, Peter tried to ban Fable, and he was the Premier of Queensland at the time. If a Premier wasn't able to ban a game with the position of power he has, then how would one random MP is going to influence that? Another factor against it being influenced was the reasoning the game got for its ban. The reason the board gave was the use of drugs and using it as a reward. That's pretty much it. The board has a record of not treating games with these concepts lightly, and the same treatment would be given to Narc. Now with Rule of Rose, there is evidence to suggest that the media did influence the game to not release in Australia. As stated before, I had some trouble in Europe with the politicians calling out the game. To explain this further, because of the controversy in Europe, it got to the point where there was a motion put forward in European Parliament to ban Rule of Rose. Regarding the game being banned in Europe, I'm not sure if it has passed or not. But at the very least, the developers decided to can the release date for Rule of Rose in the UK, and there was talks in Italy to ban the game as well. But other than discussions, I don't think this went any further than that. Whether countries have a ban or not, it's pretty clear that this heavily affected the game negatively, as it only managed to sell around 10 to 20,000 copies in this entire lifetime. To put in a comparison on how bad this is, there is a few comparisons here on some games that were released in the same year with the total copies they sold. With Australia, it seems like they took a similar approach to what they did in the UK, which is not releasing the game. Plus, with the game getting bad publicity, they probably didn't want to deal with more negative receptions. Even with that though, it's still not directly confirmed what caused them to not release it in Australia, even with the evidence suggesting interference. With the game getting bad publicity, while it doesn't look good on the product, it doesn't mean that it will be banned or get the support from politicians. A good example of this is GTA 5. The game caused a media frenzy here, to the point where they say that GTA 5 was promoting violence against women, which did get Kmart and Target to pull the game off their shelves. But other than that, that was the only point where the game's performance in the market in Australia was affected. Oh yeah, one thing I want to clarify is that with GTA 5, the reason I didn't include it in games that had interference is that I'm looking at products that had long-term effects, like ban or having their age ratings affected. With GTA, while interference did happen, it was only short-term, as only a few companies decided to not put GTA 5 on their shelves. But while bad publicity doesn't guarantee a ban on the game, it still doesn't mean there will be no negative repercussions. Plus, with the bad publicity argument, Punchline, the makers of Rule of Rose, and Rockstar during this time are completely different companies. Rockstar used controversies as its marketing tool. The only time a controversy did negatively affect their game was the hot coffee incident. Other than that, Rockstar was smart with their approach to controversies and using it as a marketing tool. Something that works in Rockstar's favour, while with other companies, rather than succeeding, could lead to the death of their game. But in the end, with both games, there is no direct confirmation of the band's possible interference, even with the supposed evidence. At this point, whether you believe they did have direct influence or not, is for your conclusion to make. There is one more incident that I want to mention. If you did look at the reviews classification website, you'll find that there is a section on the timeline page, 2013 to be more specific, where 12 games were randomly reviewed. At first, I wasn't able to find any information about it, and just thought they were randomly reviewed. At some point, I've come across a game named Deadly Premonition, which was released in 2010, where they show reluctance in showing the game to the board as they believe it didn't fit under the MA15+ rating. But in 2013, when the R18 rating was introduced, they decided to send the game for a review, which received the MA15+ rating. So they were just a little too cautious at the beginning. While good news, the Australian Council on Children and the media were unhappy with their decision and believed that Deadly Premonition, among other certain games that received MA15+, should get an R18 rating instead. They weren't the only ones who weren't happy with this, as the Australian Family Association also joined in with the complaints. The classification review report for Deadly Premonition not only mentions the Australian Family Association and the Australian Council on Children and the media, but it also mentions the Minister's application for the review. This Minister was the South Australian Attorney General. From what it looks like, John was alerted by the Australian Council on Children and the media about these games and decided to get involved. At the same time, I believe he was also pushing his own agenda, as he made comments on how he doesn't believe the guidelines doesn't go far enough, and of course, saying that it exposes children. He even went as far as to plan to get rid of the MA15+ rating when the R18 rating was going to be introduced, but backflipped on those plans. The classification review report also mentions Interactive Games and Entertainment Association, but I believe the submission wasn't sided with John, the Family Association, and the Council, but rather against the review of 12 games, as they made comments slamming John with the decision making he made. Now with the classification review report, this was about Deadly Premonition. I checked the other 11 reports of the other games and pretty much all of it is the same. The only difference is the game that is reviewing and the discussion of that. In the end, the 12 games that were reviewed led to no changes being made to their rating. All that came out of this was wasting time and around 330,000 taxpayers' dollars. When I started researching this topic, I didn't expect it to be this complex. I always knew that Australia was tough with games, but I didn't expect, well, this, and what turned from a curiosity viewpoint turned into a project, as I think this is an interesting discussion to talk about. With what lies ahead for the board's history, I can't really say. People with power always change along with laws, which makes it hard to make a definite conclusion about what the board could do with the rating system it currently has. One thing I'll say though is that the board has improved over the last decade, but, like ourselves, there's always a need for more improvements. Video games might have the least luck when dealing with the board, but that's not the only media that has been affected. Films and other media have been affected as well, which can be a discussion for another time. During the final stages of making this video, I've discovered a new page I wasn't aware of. This page lists every government or organization interferences across all kinds of media. The number of media affected speaks for itself. I don't know every media that's shown here, I'll admit that, and there will be some here that most definitely deserves to be questioned, and from what I've gathered, a lot of them didn't have any changes made when challenged by someone higher up. But this brings into question how necessary all of these interferences really are. Based on Chapter 3, people higher up have their own censored biased opinion, and they're letting that affect their judgmental thoughts with all this, which isn't ideal to do. But like the board's history, in the past decade, interferences have drastically dropped off since 2013, which, coincidentally, is when the 18+ was introduced. There was 2 interferences after 2013, which one of those 2 medias was Cuties. Even when challenged and with all of the controversy surrounding this movie, it still somehow manages to keep the original MA15+ rating. Again, the board has flaws. But one thing that needs to be pointed out is that a lot of their decisions are based on laws and guidelines that are in place, and they have to follow that. But with that though, people will point out that, as shown in Chapter 2, a lot of their decisions are not as equal as it should be, or a wrong judgment with some particular games. So there's still more that the board needs to improve on. With the board improving, however, the question remains whether we'll see the board improve, stay the same, or in a worst case scenario, go back to the 2000s days. Time will tell.